The July sun pressed heavily over the backyard as Victoria stood by the grill, flipping burgers and wiping sweat from her forehead. Her 12-year-old daughter Sandra sat on the patio with her laptop balanced on her knees, typing as if she were racing a quiet deadline. "Still working?" Victoria called, and Sandra nodded without looking up. For someone so young, her discipline surprised everyone around her. A moment later, Victoria's sister Karen pulled into the driveway, and her 3 kids ran straight toward the pool. Karen walked over holding store-bought salad with a smile that already hinted at trouble. "Sorry we're late," Karen said in a tone that didn't sound sorry as she adjusted her oversized sunglasses. Victoria simply nodded, already used to her sister's dramatic entrances and constant competition. Karen loved comparing everything: children, houses, jobs, and even small achievements. Their mother walked closer and asked, "Where's Mark today?" referring to Karen's husband. "Golf tournament, some big business thing," Karen replied with a careless wave. Victoria turned back to the grill, hoping the day would stay peaceful even though her sister rarely allowed that to happen. The afternoon moved along with the sound of children splashing and laughter filling the yard while the smell of grilled food drifted through the air. Through everything, Sandra stayed focused on her laptop, typing with quiet intensity. Karen eventually noticed and asked loudly, "What is she doing over there now?" "Working on a project," Victoria replied calmly while flipping another burger. "A project? During summer?" Karen raised her brows with disbelief. Victoria sighed and said, "She enjoys it," though she could already feel tension rising. Karen walked straight to the patio and leaned over Sandra with a forced smile. "Hey sweetheart, what are you working on?" she asked. "Code," Sandra answered softly without breaking her focus. "Code? Like real computer code?" Karen laughed as if she didn't believe it. "Tyler took a coding class last semester. He got an A. He could help you if you're stuck." Sandra finally replied, "I'm not stuck," and her calm tone made Karen's smile fade into something sharper. "You've been on that thing all day," Karen complained, her voice growing irritated. "Don't you think it's time for a break?" Sandra replied, "I need to finish this." Karen crossed her arms and said, "Finish what? It's just a hobby. You're 12. Before Victoria could step in, Karen reached toward the laptop and said, "Tyler's tablet died and he's bored. Let him use your computer. My kids need it more right now." Sandra slowly looked up, her eyes steady and cold, and repeated, "Your kids need it more?" Karen blinked, surprised by the firmness in Sandra's voice, and the whole patio seemed to fall silent at once. "Well, yes," Karen said, forcing a laugh. "You've been hogging it all day and Tyler needs something to do." Sandra tilted her head slightly and said, "He wants to check game stats, right?" Karen nodded quickly, glad for something to defend. "Yes, exactly," she insisted, "and he's actually interested in technology." Sandra looked straight at her aunt and said, "He can't even turn it on." The words landed like a stone in a quiet lake and everyone stared. Karen's face flushed as she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Excuse me," she snapped, clearly offended. Sandra repeated calmly, "Tyler can't turn on my laptop." She opened the device again and tapped the corner of the screen. "It requires biometric authentication and a 16-digit pass key," she explained. "Even if someone got past that, they wouldn't understand what's inside." Karen stared in disbelief while several family members leaned in, suddenly curious about what Sandra was protecting so fiercely. Victoria rushed over, ready to interrupt, but Sandra had already stood from her chair, tall and steady for a 12-year-old. She walked to the patio table and opened her laptop so everyone could see the glowing screen. Lines of code, graphs, charts, and colorful dashboards filled the display like something from a tech company. "What is that?" Victoria's mother asked, sounding both confused and amazed. "It's an application I've been building," Sandra said softly but confidently. "It's a resource management system for small medical practices." Sandra pointed at different sections on the screen as the adults gathered around her. "This part handles patient scheduling," she said. "This one manages inventory and reordering. This one automates billing reminders." Karen shook her head slowly, unable to find words. "You built that?" Victoria's brother, Uncle John, asked with wide eyes. Sandra nodded and added, "I'm submitting it to a youth technology competition next week. First place is a $50,000 scholarship and mentorship from real software engineers." Karen stood frozen, her expression shifting from disbelief to something pale and unsettled. "You're 12, she whispered as if the number should make the project impossible. "I know how old I am," Sandra replied, her voice even. "I also know that Tyler failed his intro coding class, even though he copied his final project from YouTube." Karen's mouth dropped open in shock, but she couldn't form a response. Sandra continued, "I'm not trying to be rude. I'm explaining why he can't use my laptop. This isn't a toy." The patio stayed quiet as the reality of Sandra's work settled over everyone. Victoria stood beside her daughter, stunned by how much she had been doing in silence. Karen finally found her voice and said, "That is incredibly disrespectful. You don't talk to adults like that." Sandra looked at her aunt calmly and replied, "You asked why I couldn't share my laptop. I'm answering." Her words were steady, but Victoria noticed a hint of nervousness in her daughter's hands. "I wasn't trying to insult anyone," Sandra continued, her voice still controlled. "Tyler asked what the big deal was and I explained." Karen scoffed loudly and waved her hand in frustration. "You're acting arrogant," she snapped. "And that's what happens when kids spend too much time staring at screens." Victoria stepped forward and said quietly, "Karen, maybe let her finish." But Karen crossed her arms tightly, unwilling to back down. Sandra pulled up another window showing a list of past winners from the competition. "Last year," she said, pointing to one name, "a 15-year-old built a flood prediction algorithm. The year before, a 13-year-old made a tool that helps detect skin cancer early." Several adults leaned in closer, impressed by the accomplishments of children Sandra's age. "The judges don't care how old you are," Sandra explained softly. "They care if your code works." Karen stared, still unable to accept what she was hearing. Uncle John took out his phone and said, "Let me check the competition website." After scrolling for a few seconds, his eyes widened. "These requirements are serious," he said. "You need documentation, references, even security audits if you're handling sensitive data." He looked at Sandra and asked, "Do you have all this?" Sandra nodded and replied, "Yes. Dr. Harris wrote one recommendation, my computer teacher wrote another, and I hired a security consultant for the audit." Victoria blinked in shock. "You hired a consultant?" she asked slowly. Sandra nodded again. "She found 3 issues I didn't notice and she taught me how to strengthen my encryption." Karen opened her mouth but nothing came out, her disbelief stuck somewhere between anger and confusion. Victoria's mother stepped closer to Sandra and asked, "How long have you been working on this?" Sandra answered quietly, "About 6 months." Uncle John leaned forward, clearly impressed now rather than shocked. "What does it actually do for doctors?" he asked. Sandra turned her laptop toward him again. "It reduces scheduling conflicts, automates reminders, and organizes financial reports," she explained. "Some offices spend 6 hours a week handling just scheduling problems." Then she added, "My system can reduce that to about 20 minutes. John let out a long whistle, unable to hide his admiration. Victoria felt both proud and overwhelmed as she listened to her daughter explain everything with such calm confidence. "So when you said you were working on a project," she said gently, "you meant this the entire time?" Sandra nodded, her expression showing a small flicker of worry. "I didn't want to say anything until I knew it worked," she admitted. "What if I couldn't finish it?" Victoria placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But you did finish it," she said softly. Karen suddenly grabbed her purse, her frustration boiling over. "We're leaving," she announced sharply. "I don't have to sit here and watch my children be embarrassed by some show-off who thinks she's better than everyone." Sandra looked down at her laptop, not responding. "Come on, kids," Karen yelled, and Tyler, Megan, and Brian rushed to grab their things. The air tightened as anger and discomfort filled the backyard. At the car, Karen turned back with a look that could slice glass. "You know what?" she snapped. "I hope you lose. I hope you get to that competition and realize you're not as special as you think you are." Sandra didn't speak a word, her silence stronger than any response. Karen slammed the door and the minivan sped out of the driveway. No one moved for a moment. Even the kids by the pool stayed quiet. Uncle John finally broke the silence with a small laugh. "Well," he said, "that was something." Victoria walked over to Sandra, feeling both protective and proud. "I'm sorry," she told her daughter softly. "I should have stepped in sooner." Sandra shook her head and replied, "It's okay. Aunt Karen is always like that." Victoria sighed and said, "Still, you handled yourself well." For the first time since the confrontation, Sandra looked up and smiled. Victoria's mother walked closer and placed her hands gently on Sandra's shoulders. "You were calm," she said softly, "and that is not easy when someone is shouting." Sandra nodded, though Victoria could see the tension still lingering in her daughter's eyes. "Do you think she hates me now?" Sandra asked quietly. "No," Victoria replied, "she just hates seeing someone do what her own kids cannot." Her mother added, "Some people mistake confidence for arrogance when they feel insecure." Sandra sat back at the table and reopened her laptop, her fingers moving quickly again. Victoria watched her for a moment, amazed by how easily she returned to her focus. "You're really not upset?" Victoria asked softly. Sandra shrugged and said, "Maybe a little, but I'm used to Aunt Karen saying things like that." Victoria sighed, wishing her daughter didn't have to build such emotional armor so young. "You handled it better than some adults," Victoria said quietly. Sandra smiled just a little and kept typing. Later, when the guests had settled down again, Uncle John returned to Sandra's side. "I want to see the demo," he said eagerly. Sandra clicked a few buttons and pulled up a clean, organized interface that looked surprisingly professional. John raised both brows and said, "This looks better than some software I use in my own office." Sandra laughed softly and replied, "Thank you. I wanted it to be easy for anyone to understand." Victoria felt her heart swell with pride at her daughter's confidence. John studied the dashboard carefully, nodding with growing excitement. "I know at least a dozen dentists who would buy this in a heartbeat," he said. "It would save them time, money, and stress." Sandra shook her head gently and said, "I can't sell it yet. The competition rules won't allow commercialization until after judging." John looked impressed by her understanding of the rules. "And if you win?" he asked. Sandra smiled and said, "Then I'll decide how to license it." Victoria sat beside her daughter, trying to absorb everything she was hearing. She had bought Sandra the laptop for her birthday, thinking it would help with school projects and simple coding lessons. She never imagined her daughter would build something that adults considered valuable. Sandra looked at her mother and said softly, "Thank you for buying it for me." Victoria smiled and replied, "Thank you for using it for something amazing." The moment felt warm, quiet, and unforgettable. As the sun dipped lower, the rest of the family began packing up their things. Victoria's mother kept asking Sandra questions about the app, fascinated by every detail. "How do you even learn all this?" she asked. Sandra answered, "Mostly online courses and practice." "A lot of practice." Victoria chuckled and said, "That's an understatement." Sandra looked up and smiled shyly, realizing how proud everyone was of her. The kids who remained at the pool whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Sandra. Some looked impressed, others simply confused by everything they had witnessed. Victoria noticed Tyler's forgotten water bottle sitting near the grill but didn't pick it up. "Should we call them to return it?" her mother asked. "No," Victoria said softly, "not today." She didn't want to invite another argument before the day ended. That evening, after everyone had left, Victoria found Sandra still at the kitchen table, typing steadily. "Hey," Victoria said as she pulled out a chair beside her. Sandra looked up and smiled lightly. "Hi, Mom." Victoria sighed and said, "I'm proud of you, not just for the app but for how you handled everything today." Sandra saved her work and closed the laptop quietly. "I didn't want to make Tyler feel bad," she said gently. "I know," Victoria replied, brushing a loose curl from Sandra's face. "But sometimes the truth can make people uncomfortable." Sandra nodded slowly, thinking about the argument. "Do you think I was arrogant?" she asked. Victoria shook her head. "No," she said, "I think you were confident. There's a difference." Sandra's shoulders relaxed, relieved by the answer. Sandra leaned back in her chair, her voice thoughtful. "I guess Aunt Karen was just mad because Tyler couldn't answer any of my questions." Victoria smiled sadly and said, "Maybe so, but you already knew he couldn't before you asked." Sandra looked guilty for a moment. "Maybe I pushed too hard," she admitted. Victoria nodded gently. "Next time try to soften your answers. You can be right without making someone feel small." Sandra nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." 3 weeks later, Sandra rushed into the living room holding her phone with both hands. "Mom," she said breathlessly, "they sent the results." Victoria felt her heart skip as she stood up quickly. "Well?" she asked, trying to stay calm. Sandra's face broke into the biggest smile Victoria had ever seen. "I made it to the finals," she said softly. Victoria screamed with joy and hugged her daughter so tightly that Sandra laughed in her arms. Victoria immediately called her parents, who began crying with happiness the moment they heard the news. Uncle John sent a message saying he was booking flights to Seattle right away. "We're all going," he wrote proudly. Sandra covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed but excited. Victoria laughed and said, "Get used to it. You're officially the family genius now." Sandra groaned but also smiled at the same time. Later that evening, Sandra sat at the dining table reviewing her presentation notes. Victoria watched her daughter rehearse answers to imaginary questions, pacing back and forth like a tiny professional. "Do you think the judges will like me?" Sandra asked suddenly. Victoria walked over, sat beside her and said, "They won't just like you. They'll respect you." Sandra nodded quietly and continued practicing, determined to be ready. Meanwhile, rumors had already reached Karen through family whispers, although Victoria hadn't called her. Karen sent no message, offered no congratulations and made no attempt to apologize. Victoria wasn't surprised. Pride rarely let her sister soften first. Sandra noticed the silence too, but she didn't ask about it. Instead, she focused on her project, her notes, and the opportunity waiting for her in Seattle. Victoria admired her daughter's strength more each day. The night before the trip, Sandra packed her laptop, her documentation, and a small notebook filled with last-minute reminders. "Do you think I'm ready?" she asked again, her voice quiet and unsure. Victoria knelt beside her suitcase and said, "You're more than ready." Sandra took a deep breath, trying to calm the mix of nerves and excitement pulsing through her. "I just want to do my best," she whispered. "You will," Victoria said with certainty. On the morning of the flight, the whole family gathered at the airport except Karen's household. Victoria's parents hugged Sandra repeatedly, unable to contain their pride. Uncle John grinned from ear to ear, carrying a small banner he'd made that said, "Go Sandra." Sandra blushed, hiding her smile behind her hands. "This is embarrassing," she muttered softly. Victoria laughed and said, "Get used to it. This is what support looks like." In Seattle, the competition hall buzzed with young talent from across the country. Sandra walked between rows of booths, staring at robotics displays, AI models, and apps built by other finalists her age. "They're all so smart," she whispered. Victoria put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "And so are you," she said gently. Sandra swallowed hard and nodded, telling herself to stay focused. When it was Sandra's turn to present, she stepped onto the stage with her laptop in hand. Her voice shook at first, but as soon as she began explaining her system, the fear slowly melted away. She spoke with clarity, confidence, and passion, just as she had practiced. The judges nodded often, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Sandra answered each one with steady composure. Victoria watched from the audience with tears rising in her eyes. After the presentation, several finalists approached Sandra to compliment her work. "Your interface is really clean," one boy said. Another girl added, "Your data model was super impressive." Sandra smiled shyly, surprised to feel accepted among so many talented peers. Victoria hugged her afterward and said, "No matter what happens next, I'm proud of you." Sandra nodded, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. A week later, when the family returned home, Sandra settled back into her usual routine of quiet work and steady focus. Karen never called, never congratulated, and never spoke about what happened that afternoon in the backyard. But Victoria realized something important. Sandra no longer needed her aunt's validation or anyone else's approval. She had found her own confidence, one built from discipline, creativity, and courage. And as Victoria watched her daughter open her laptop again, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of Sandra's incredible journey.